At about 6 o'clock in the morning of Wednesday, December 4th, 1991, a Boeing 727 owned by American Airways, named the Clipper Goodwill, took off from John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York City. This was Flight 219 headed for Bridgetown, Barbados, about a 4.5-hour flight. There was a small load of passengers on board. The plane was piloted by Mark Pyle, an 18-year veteran of PanAm, and First Officer Robert Knox. While Flight 219 was en route, some strange things were happening back at PanAm's terminal at JFK Airport. It used to be located here. As you can see in this Google Earth image, it's now a parking lot for jets. The fact that they're Delta jets is kind of ironic when you know the end of this story. For over 50 years, between 1960 and 2013, this site was an airline terminal called the Worldport, an exemplar of mid-century 1960s space-age aesthetic, similar in many ways to the architecture of the 1964 World's Fair, also in New York. The Worldport sought to bring passengers to jet airplanes and vice versa, in the grand, flashy, stylish way that exemplified what was once America's flag carrier airline, at least overseas. There was nothing like PanAm, and after it was gone, there would be nothing like it ever again. On that morning, December 4th, operations here at the Worldport opened as usual, but then after a short time they began to close down. Employees walked off the job. The gates and ticket counters went quiet. A PanAm plane from New York to the Dominican Republic had just boarded when word came to take the passengers off the plane. They sat in the gate area waiting, but no one came. Baggage carts were empty. Planes painted with the PanAm logo, the unmistakable blue globe, sat parked at the Worldport with no activity. Early that morning, an order had been issued from this building, the PanAm building, now called the MetLife building, on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. The CEO of the company, Russell Ray, who had only been on the job about 8 weeks, issued the order to get all of PanAm's planes and as many of their employees as possible back to the United States. As of 9 o'clock a.m. on December 4th, all of PanAm's operations were shutting down. The stand-down order was the culmination of a burst of activity that had been going on through long hours of the day, all through the previous weekend and the first 2 days of that week. Russell Ray, various other executives of PanAm, lawyers and financial people, had been in endless feverish rounds of meetings in this building and various other offices in Manhattan on a last-ditch deal that would have saved the airline. Delta Airlines, which had been in negotiations to buy what was left of PanAm, had pulled the plug on the deal late in the day the previous Sunday, December 1st. When Mark Pyle and Robert Knox showed up for work that morning to fly Flight 219 to Barbados, they knew the Delta deal had cratered. CNN had reported it the night before, but no word had come yet to stand down, so they took off on schedule, as was their job. After landing at Barbados, the passengers of Flight 219 deplaned, and then the PanAm station manager walked up and entered the cockpit. He had with him the official telex from New York, telling them of the shutdown and ordering the planes back to American soil. This one, the Clipper Goodwill, would go to Miami. The problem was, though, that with the airline shut down, they couldn't even refuel. The station manager promised the pilots he'd find a way to get them fueled, even if he had to buy the fuel himself. The crew made the decision to wait as long as possible so passengers who wanted to return, meaning not be stranded in Barbados with no flight back, could get their belongings together and return to the plane. Some of the crew were in tears. Many of them had worked for PanAm for decades. Not only were they out of work, but in many cases their pension plans had been cut back or eliminated. There was a real human cost to the decision to shut down the airline. At 2 o'clock p.m., the PanAm 727, now designated Flight 436, took off from Bridgetown, headed for Miami. While they were in flight, the word came that the Clipper Goodwill was the very last American Airways plane still in the air. Every other plane had either been grounded or had already landed somewhere on American soil. As a gesture of farewell to the airline that had arguably built American commercial aviation, the control tower requested the plane make a low pass over the field on its way to landing. The pilot, Mark Pyle, told and retold the story of the final flight many times over the next months and years. A version of it appeared in the Miami Herald a few weeks after the PanAm shutdown. By chance, he was the last pilot to make a scheduled revenue flight for American Airways. It was 64 years, 1 month, and 16 days since the very first scheduled revenue flight, which took off from Key West, Florida on October 19, 1927, bound for Havana, Cuba. This video is the story of what happened during those 64 years, from the rise of America's most iconic airline in the 1920s to its fall in the 1990s, and why it's worth remembering. This is PanAm, the Rise and Fall. Hi, I'm Sean Munger. I have a PhD in history, and my niche here on YouTube is doing long, deep dive videos on various historical topics, especially ones that I think are a little obscure or deserve a closer look than they usually get. Now, to be sure, there's nothing obscure about Pan American Airways. It's a big story, front and center, in the history of 20th century commercial aviation. But with as much material as there is out there about PanAm, including here on YouTube, most of it seems to be missing something, mainly the depth of this subject and its many historical connections. The word airline simply doesn't do PanAm the justice it deserves. PanAm wasn't just a system to haul people and mail and cargo from place to place, usually between continents. It was a pioneering force in aviation, the first to deploy flying boats that crossed the Atlantic and Pacific on a regular schedule. It was a political force. If PanAm's principal founder, Juan Trippe, hadn't been in the airline business in the 20th century, he might have been a field marshal in early 19th century France, knitting together an empire with strategic conquests and daring gambles. PanAm was, in many real ways, an empire. PanAm was also an aesthetic. Those dashing pilots in their snazzy uniforms, the gorgeous stewardesses, the planes themselves, which were sleek, futuristic, and for a time, especially in the 1950s when the 707 was new, and the 70s when the 747 was new, they were like riding rockets into the future. James Bond flew PanAm, Indiana Jones flew PanAm, the astronauts in 2001: A Space Odyssey flew PanAm. I can't recall whether Don Draper was ever seen getting on a PanAm plane in the classic TV series Mad Men, but if he didn't, he should have. There was something about PanAm, something unique and special and historic. Probably a significant portion of the audience of this video wasn't alive yet when PanAm ceased operations in 1991. For those of you, I hope this video makes you wish, at least a little, that you had been around to see it. On the other hand, this video might attract an audience of people who do remember PanAm, who flew on it, worked for it, or were otherwise part of its story. For those of you who are in that category, I hope this video does justice to that story. I started the story at the end of PanAm. Obviously, we have to go back to the beginning. In fact, before the beginning. PanAm is a 20th century story, but we're going to start at the tail end of the 19th century, the year 1899, 4 years before the airplane was even invented. There's a particular person we need to start with. His name is Juan Trippe, and his story is in the next chapter. This is Seabright, New Jersey, one of your classic Jersey Shore resort towns, not far from New York City. On June 27, 1899, Juan Terry Trippe was born in this town. His parents were wealthy. His father was an investment banker. Despite his first name, Juan Trippe had no Hispanic heritage. His family were old money wasps all the way, having first settled in Maryland in early colonial times. The story of PanAm really begins with Juan Trippe. He was not only its CEO for decades, but in a way the company embodied him, the way of his thinking, his ambitions, the way he saw the world, and unfortunately his misperceptions of it, particularly later in his career. You simply can't separate the history of PanAm from the life of Juan Trippe. The short version of that life, at least the early part, is this. Born into wealth and privilege, Trippe was exactly the right age to catch the flying bug early. At age 10, he saw a primitive air race over New York Harbor, and from then on he was captivated by airplanes. He dropped out of Yale in 1917 after the United States joined World War I. Trippe hoped to fly in combat. He'd had some civilian flight training even before the war, but the armistice came in November 1918 before he could get into the fight. In the years after the conflict ended, he was one of the many young men who had this skill, unique for that time, flying airplanes, and sought to make money from it. But the civilian applications of aviation were pretty slim and paltry in the years after World War I. This was the barnstorming era, where pilots, most of them ex-military, scraped together money by doing death-defying aerial stunts and giving people plane rides at county fairs and such. Trippe didn't do that sort of thing. He was, after all, the son of a banker, and he worked on Wall Street for a while in the early 20s. But hating that, you can't blame him, he started a company of his own called Long Island Airways, which shuttled rich passengers from the city to their summer vacation homes on Long Island. It was a good idea, but it didn't work. Trippe's primitive airline for the Hamptons crowd went bust in 1924. Juan Trippe grasped very early on a fact that many people in the aviation industry didn't understand at first, and in some cases still don't. He understood that aviation simply couldn't work as a traditional for-profit business in the free market. It could only work as sort of a public-private utility, semi-regulated and subsidized. Airlines carrying human beings, if they were ever to exist at any significant scale, would have to piggyback on government subsidies for carrying mail. In 1925, Congress passed the Airmail Act, also known as the Kelly Act, which enabled the U.S. Post Office to contract with private companies for carrying U.S. mail by air. It sounds bureaucratic and meaningless, but the Kelly Act was actually huge. It laid the groundwork for America's entire air travel system. If there was one act of genius in all of Juan Trippe's life, recognizing the opportunity of this was definitely it. Within months after President Calvin Coolidge signed the Kelly Act into law, Trippe was angling to form a for-profit airline by getting awarded federal contracts to carry mail by air. His first serious attempt at this was called Colonial Air Transport, but that went bust in the spring of 1927, mainly because of Trippe's aggressive attitude toward trying to get airmail contracts. The other directors he went into business with thought he was moving too fast, and they forced him out. But two other things were happening at this same time that proved fortuitous to Trippe. One was a public stunt. Charles Lindbergh, a young airmail pilot from the Midwest, competed for and won the Orteig Prize, a $25,000 bounty for the first nonstop flight between New York and Paris. After Lindbergh touched down at Le Bourget Field in Paris on May 21, 1927, he was suddenly the most famous human being on planet Earth, no exaggeration, and suddenly everybody wanted a piece of the flying business. More importantly, Lindbergh had proved with a single pilot and a tiny plane that transatlantic flight was possible and feasible. It was only a matter of time before it would be done by multiple pilots and large planes routinely. Juan Trippe understood this, and he was positioning himself to take advantage of it. The second thing that was happening in spring 1927 was the foundation of a company to fly mail from the United States to Latin America. At first, specifically from Key West, Florida, to Havana, Cuba. That company was American Airways, founded by two bigwigs in military flying, Hap Arnold and Carl Spaatz of the U.S. Army Air Corps. They got mixed up in the mishigas involving General Billy Mitchell in 1925, who insulted the Army for not investing more heavily in aviation strategy. The airmail service for PanAm was sort of a sideline for them. As it turned out, there were three companies bidding for the Key West Havana mail route that PanAm wanted. In addition to PanAm, a company called Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean Airlines wanted it, and Juan Trippe's new venture, Aviation Corporation of America. The Assistant Postmaster General of the U.S., Warren Irving Glover, suggested the three competing groups merge and present a united front. They did. Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean and Aviation Corporation of America merged into the brand new American Airways. Juan Trippe was president and general manager of the new company, and the postmaster gave them what they wanted, the Key West Havana airmail contract. The story of Pan Am's first official flight is the stuff of legend in aviation history and of corporate lore. Trippe had acquired 2 Fokker tri-motor airplanes for the new venture. I'm not cursing, YouTube automatic content checker. That's the name of an aircraft manufacturer, spelled F-O-K-K-E-R. Anyway, Trippe had the Fokkers, but there was not yet a runway in Key West, Florida that they could take off from. He frantically had one built. The terms of the airmail contract specified that the first flight had to take off not later than October 19, 1927, or the contract would be forfeited. In the days leading up to October 19th, 2 separate attempts to finish the runway at Key West were thwarted by torrential rains that sank pits into the new runway surface. The runway was unusable for the Fokkers. Fokkers? Don't at me, pronunciation police. So, the day before the contract was up, Juan Trippe hired a private pilot with his own plane, a Fairchild FC-2 float plane that could take off and land on water, to carry 7 bags of mail to Havana. The rate Pan Am paid him was $175, about the equivalent of $3,100 in today's money. American Airways' first flight took 1 hour and 2 minutes. There were no passengers, but it was the true beginning of the Pan Am empire. What you have to understand about Pan Am's early days was that it was like Risk, the world conquest board game, except played in real life with airplanes, airmail contracts, and landing rights agreements instead of little plastic armies. Trippe was trying to take over countries and continents in this way, securing mail routes and hence passenger service between major overseas destinations, before any competitors appeared on the scene to challenge him. The first continent he conquered was South America. That was the natural progression, with the first thrust coming out of Florida into the Caribbean. Trippe negotiated with officials from various South American countries for landing rights, which was more international diplomacy than it was business or aviation. It certainly helped that on this diplomatic junket he brought Charles Lindbergh with him, still in 1929 the most famous inhabitant of planet Earth and a huge goodwill weapon for Pan Am. Trippe also started buying up small regional airlines that held contracts to deliver airmail in and to South America, absorbing them into Pan Am. He defeated an enemy, a major competitor, Grace Shipping Company, which delivered mail, by ostensibly going into business with them, a joint venture called Panagra. Supposedly a joint venture, but it was a thin veil for what was really the conquest of Grace Shipping's mail service by Pan American Airways. He did all this before the stock market crash of 1929 that brought on the Great Depression. Trippe and Pan Am had some land-based aircraft, including a couple of Ford tri-motors, a beautiful but I'm told highly uncomfortable early airliner. But his real secret weapon was a plane called the Sikorsky S-38, a flying boat, which could land or take off from land or water. No runway, no problem, so long as the pilot could find a relatively calm bay to land on. This overcame the lack of infrastructure that was characteristic of Latin America in the 1920s and 30s. Through landing rights, airmail contracts, and routes involving the Sikorsky flying boats, Trippe tied up the most populated bulk of South America with a web of Pan Am routes like strings of sticky chewing gum. Where airmail flowed, passengers followed, and the fares they paid were substantial. Air travel in this period was a luxury novelty for the very rich, but those were Trippe's people. Remember, his original junket was flying rich vacationers to the Hamptons. In these early days, air travel certainly wasn't a day at the beach, especially given turbulence at the low altitudes where most early airliners flew at that time. But still, Pan Am passengers ate in-flight meals at real tables with real silverware, and after the wicker chairs popular on the Ford tri-motor gave way to purpose-built upholstered seats in some of the later Sikorskys, plane travel started to become chic. The rapid expansion of air travel and the fact that most of the early passengers were well-to-do are part of how and why fledgling Pan Am was able to weather the Great Depression years. Many Americans in the early 30s were standing in bread lines, but aviation was one of the few industries still afloat, pardon the expression, and poised for big expansion once some kind of economic recovery took hold. In the broader game of Risk that Juan Trippe was playing, he wasn't satisfied just conquering land. He wanted the oceans too, and especially the oceans. If PanAm could secure both the contractual permissions and the technological ability to fly Americans eastward to Europe and westward to the Pacific, the airline would become America's flag carrier. Juan Trippe understood the concept of what that meant before anyone else did. By the late 1930s, he had conquered both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and those conquests were the basis of the Pan Am Empire throughout its golden age. How Juan Trippe did that and what happened as a result is the subject of the next chapter. On March 23, 1935, a brand new Sikorsky S-42 flying boat took off from Miami Harbor and flew straight out into the Atlantic. The pilot behind the controls was Edwin Musick, a former civilian and military flight instructor, whom Juan Trippe had chosen as the chief pilot of the new Sikorsky aircraft, which had been designed by Sikorsky Aircraft to Trippe's specifications. The purpose of the Miami flight was to test whether the flying boat could stay aloft for the time and distance needed to fly from San Francisco to Hawaii. This was one of several range and fuel consumption test flights done, mostly by Ed Musick, as a means to develop Pan Am's two-ocean strategy. They also had to test radio navigation equipment, which was also brand new at the time. The March flight was ultimately successful and earned Musick his first big burst of publicity. Pilots were big news in the mid-30s, especially when they made flights that broke a record or achieved something that had never been done before. There was a lot of that going on at the time. Lindbergh was succeeded by a deep bench of air stunt heroes, including Wiley Post, the first person to fly solo around the world, and even movie and aircraft mogul Howard Hughes, who also flew around the world solo. With his usual diplomatic and political audacity, Trippe had negotiated with the U.S. Navy for rights to land on two desolate Pacific islands, Wake and Midway Island. In fact, Trippe influenced the transfer of authority over those islands to the Navy by order of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1934. Wake and Midway were tiny, uninhabited bits of sand and coral in the mid-Pacific, but Juan Trippe, playing Risk again, realized they would be crucial for Pan Am to establish a trans-Pacific airline route. But it would only work if he had the planes that could physically do it. The range and fuel requirements to fly from San Francisco to Hawaii, the longest part of the proposed route, were at the far outside reach of what was technologically possible for aircraft in 1935. But this is where Trippe lived and worked, at the far edge of what was possible. Musick's March 1935 flight was followed by several others, including a test of the new Sikorsky S-42 from San Francisco to Hawaii, and then Hawaii back to San Francisco, especially treacherous due to headwinds that increased fuel consumption. But even a flight that barely made it, as Edwin Musick's test flight from Hawaii to San Francisco on June 22, 1935 did, was enough for Trippe. While these test flights were being conducted, engineers working for Pan Am were hastily assembling infrastructure on Wake and Midway, sent there by ship. On Wake Island, engineers had to use underwater explosives to blast enough coral out of the lagoon to make a landing by a Sikorsky flying boat safe enough to attempt. Environmentally, this was highly questionable, but ultimately it worked. The first Pan Am test landing on the Wake Island Lagoon was made August 17, 1935, by Rod Sullivan, Ed Musick's former co-pilot. By 1935, the regulatory environment had also changed. The federal government's practices of awarding airmail contracts as per that 1925 act blew up into a major scandal in 1934, and the new administration of Franklin Roosevelt, who reportedly detested Juan Trippe personally, revoked most of the contracts that had been awarded. Pan Am was still in the game, though, at least with respect to airmail to the Far East, mainly because they were the only serious option, though smaller upstart operations were nipping at Juan Trippe's heels the whole time. Still, he was the only one who had all three of the elements you needed to establish a transoceanic airline route: the planes that could get there, the landing rights, and the infrastructure at the destinations to handle the planes. The first regularly scheduled Pacific route flight went off, which carried mail, not passengers, went off in late November and early December 1935. PanAm was now officially flying from San Francisco to Manila in the Philippines via stops at Hawaii, Midway, Wake Island, and Guam. The plane that did it wasn't even a Sikorsky, but rather a Martin M130, a bigger flying boat that was in the testing phase when Edwin Muzik made the pioneering flights earlier that year. The first flights on this route carrying actual paying passengers commenced about a year later, in October 1936. Juan Trippe named the planes that made these voyages Clippers, after the famous sailing ships of the 19th century. What's known in Pan Am history as the Clipper era had begun. At this juncture, I have to say something about a prominent cultural depiction of Pan Am's early Pacific service. In one of my favorite moments of one of my all-time favorite movies, Raiders of the Lost Ark, a moving line on a map shows us the progress of swashbuckling archaeologist Indiana Jones as he travels from the U.S. to Nepal. Jones is seen boarding a flying boat in a harbor, and then the line interspersed with special effects footage of an airplane flying across the Pacific. The route traced by the line is mostly accurate, though it seems to skip Midway. Pan Am did not fly from Manila to Nepal, though presumably Jones could have gotten some kind of air charter from those hops. I'm headcanoning here. With respect to the Clipper route across the Pacific, it is possible that a paying passenger could have flown this route during the year 1936 when the film takes place, if it was late in the year, after October, when the service was initiated. But apparently it is after October because as Jones boards the plane, one of the Nazi bad guys shadowing him is seen reading a Life magazine. The particular issue he's reading is the issue dated November 30th, 1936. Surprisingly accurate for an Indiana Jones picture, the only inaccurate thing here, aside from skipping Midway, is the aircraft seen in the boarding shot. It is not a Martin M130, but rather a short Solent Mark III. In 1980, when the picture was being filmed, the producers couldn't find a real Martin M130 with a working engine. Although the short Solent resembles it, that plane actually did not fly until 1946, a decade after the depiction. Of course, this route would have been very spendy in 1936. The one-way fare was about $950, which is the equivalent of over $20,000 in today's money. Jones, though, is working for Army intelligence in this film, so they might simply have requisitioned this seat for him. Anyway, back to the real history of Pan Am. As for the other ocean, the Atlantic, Juan Trippe turned his attention to conquering it the following year, 1937. He followed the same pattern: diplomatic contract negotiations for landing rights, followed by test flights of various aircraft, and ultimately the institution of regular service. Pan Am had two main routes across the Atlantic: the northern route, which utilized Newfoundland and Ireland, and a southern route, hopping from North America to the Azores to Portugal. Various types of flying boats were used for this service, including the Boeing 314, the largest and most advanced airliner of its time. By the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939, Juan Trippe's immense game of global risk had definitely paid off. He owned South America and the Caribbean. He owned the Pacific route. He owned the Atlantic route, which was the jewel in the crown. Many of his audacious gambles weren't profitable in isolation, but air travel was becoming so critical in the late 30s that Pan Am as a whole couldn't help but make money. There were incidents and accidents, of course. The most well-publicized one was the loss of the Samoan Clipper, a Sikorsky S-42, which blew up while trying to land at Pago Pago in American Samoa in January 1938. Edwin Muzik, the hero airline pilot, was killed in this disaster. Later that same year, there was also the disappearance of a Clipper on the Pacific route, the Hawaii Clipper, an M130, which vanished between Guam and Manila on July 28, 1938, presumably killing 15 people. One of the grim things about running an airline is that people will be killed while using your service, sooner or later. Air travel in the 1930s was not nearly as safe as it is now, but on the other hand, these early planes carried only a handful of passengers at a time, so truly mass casualty disasters were still a few decades away. A fact to note about Pan Am in this era that becomes very important later is the kind of corporate culture the airline was developing. Pan Am pilots like Edwin Muzik were still regarded early in their careers in much the same way as those stunt flyers of the 1920s and early 30s, like Lindbergh and Wiley Post, who thrilled the newspapers with their record-breaking exploits. These guys, most of whom started flying in the barnstorming or even the World War I eras, were risk takers. They would push airplanes to their farthest technical limits and do maneuvers, especially tricky takeoffs and landings, that were often risky or at least unorthodox. They had to, by definition. Pan Am was the only airline doing what it was doing in 1939 on the scale they were doing it. Pilots had to land in the lagoons of distant atolls or bays and coves, sometimes where there were rough seas, headwinds, or other unfavorable conditions. And the captains, Juan Trippe insisted on using naval terminology for Pan Am personnel, were the absolute commanders of their planes. Even co-pilots were regarded as a somewhat lower form of life on the pecking order. As a result of all of this, Pan Am pilots were often difficult to get along with, stubborn, or even arrogant. Their places in the company were governed strictly by seniority, how long they'd been with the outfit. The captains who got to fly the big flashy planes on the important routes across the Atlantic and Pacific were often the ones who'd been with the company the longest. Pan Am hadn't been around very long, but as its existence stretched forward into time, it became clear that it would take junior pilots a long time to work their way up to the choice routes and the big sexy planes. That was Pan Am's culture. Remember that. It becomes important later. So, for the latter half of the 1930s, Pan Am was truly in its early golden age. Most of the romantic and nostalgic visions of the airline from the pre-jet age center around this time, what you might call the flying boat era. Pan Am was more profitable than ever before, but as we'll see in the next chapter, the world was about to change rapidly. On September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler flung his Wehrmacht army against Poland, which triggered World War II in Europe. The war was already going on and had been for some time in Asia, and particularly China, where Pan Am had significant operations, though the United States was technically still at peace with Japan. That would change, obviously, but we're not there yet. As Hitler got rolling with his monstrous conquests in Europe, Juan Trippe was fighting his own battle to keep Pan Am a monopoly on transatlantic civilian air travel. His first potential competitor was American Export Airlines, owned by a marine shipping company. After fierce political battles in Congress, and with the agency that regulated U.S. air travel, the Civil Aeronautics Board, President Roosevelt, who as you recall disliked Juan Trippe, and vice versa, signed an order in July 1940 that approved American Export opening service between New York and Lisbon, Portugal. Incidentally, to throw in another movie reference here, if you've ever seen Casablanca, all the refugees in the city of Casablanca in the story are trying to get to Lisbon, and as the narrator says at the beginning of the film, from Lisbon to the New World. The reason Lisbon was the place was because with the outbreak of the European War, the Neutrality Act prevented American-flagged carriers, meaning Pan Am, there was only one at first, from flying to belligerent countries. Portugal was neutral in World War II, and so was Ireland. But for practical reasons, Pan Am closed the Ireland route early in the war, which made Lisbon the only place where anybody could get air transport from Europe to the United States. Pan Am profited handsomely from people trying to flee Europe after the outbreak of war. The Lisbon-New York Clipper route was constantly sold out, and in 1939 and 1940, the company posted huge profits. Anyway, Juan Trippe relied on some influence in Congress to keep American Export from actually flying for several years until after the U.S. had joined World War II. And even then, its operations were small compared to Pan Am's because most of its transatlantic operations were part of the war effort. Incidentally, Pan Am played a significant role in the war. Many of its airliners were commandeered for military service after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Pan Am's two key stops in the Pacific, Midway and Wake Island, were both battlegrounds with the Japanese early in the Pacific War. Pan Am planes and personnel airlifted troops and materiel into countless theaters of war. I'm not really going to say any more than this about Pan Am's involvement in World War II, because we have to hurry up and get to the post-war period, when a new battle played out over the question of whether Pan Am could or should be the only American airline to fly overseas, or at least the Atlantic. In other words, whether it would be the U.S.'s flag carrier. Even before the war was over, in September 1943, Trippe wrote up a pamphlet principally aimed at politicians titled A Plan for the Consolidation of All American Flag Overseas and Foreign Air Transport Operations. This would eventually become a proposed congressional act which would, as the title suggested, consolidate all overseas airlines into one government-subsidized airline, which would be Pan Am, of course. Now, before you start screeching, OMG, socialism, there are a couple of things that you should know, even aside from the fact that politically, Juan Trippe was an arch conservative. First, Juan Trippe understood from the beginning, the old airmail days, that airlines, especially those that flew overseas, simply couldn't function in a free market for-profit model. The economics just didn't work. Second, a government-supported flag carrier was the model that basically every other country followed. The UK had BOAC, the British Overseas Airways Corporation. Before the war interrupted operations, the French had Air France, and the Germans had Deutsche Lufthansa, the forerunner of today's airline, Lufthansa. Third, and most importantly for our story going forward, as you'll see in future chapters, a U.S. airline that flies overseas is uniquely dependent on the domestic airlines that feed passengers into its system. The U.S. is a much bigger country than the UK, France, or Germany, whose domestic airlines are small. If you live in, say, Chicago and you need to get to London, you'll have to get a flight on a domestic airline from Chicago to some place where you can get a flight that will take you to London. New York, say. Pan Am had no domestic routes. You couldn't fly from New York to San Francisco on Pan Am unless you went down through Latin America or went all the way around the other side of the world. So, take a hypothetical example, a made-up domestic airline, Acme Air. You buy a ticket on Acme Air to take you from Chicago to New York. To get the rest of the way to your destination, London, of course, you can buy a ticket on a Pan Am flight from New York to London. But if BOAC, a British airline, flies the same route between London and New York, you might decide to buy a ticket from them instead, especially if it was a little bit cheaper. BOAC might be incentivized to cut Acme Air passengers a deal on their tickets from New York to London if, say, Acme Air cut BOAC passengers a deal on tickets for British passengers who wanted to travel on to Chicago after reaching New York. So, you see how this works? The overseas carrier that's most likely to sell the ticket is the one that gets passengers fed into their system from domestic carriers, who in turn feed passengers to them. Juan Trippe argued that this was bad for America as a whole, especially if the flag carriers of other countries, like BOAC, could operate with subsidies from their governments to offer perks that competing American-run overseas carriers couldn't afford if they were in competition with each other and trying to undercut each other on price. BOAC can serve you tea and fresh crumpets on their flights because the government pays for part of it. If Pan Am wants to compete on perks like that, they have to go out of pocket to do it. Furthermore, Pan Am paid its pilots and crew far more than the foreign carriers did because parts of their salaries were government subsidized. Now, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with Juan Trippe's argument. I'm just pointing out that it wasn't totally about his own self-interest in keeping Pan Am's transatlantic monopoly. He did have reasons for wanting it to be done this way. Furthermore, there was something a little unfair in how the government agency, the CAB, treated Pan Am. They refused to allow Pan Am to open domestic routes, as Juan Trippe proposed in 1945 to streamline the system. So if Pan Am was forbidden from being a domestic carrier, thus relegated by special status to being an overseas carrier, shouldn't it be the only overseas carrier, and the domestic airlines forbidden from opening routes overseas? The political and personal conflicts over Trippe's suggested restructuring of the U.S. commercial aviation sphere are the central part of about the second half of Martin Scorsese's 2004 film The Aviator, which is principally about Howard Hughes, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this. The movie is partially accurate, but the story it tells is extremely simplified. Trippe, played in the movie by Alec Baldwin, didn't really see Hughes as a personal nemesis, and it was not just the opposition of TWA, which Hughes renamed Trans World Airlines, but all the other major U.S. carriers as well, including United and American. The movie calls the legislative proposal the CAB bill. Actually, it was called the Community Company Bill. It wasn't one bill, but several, and it played out over a longer time frame than the movie depicts. Ultimately, the Community Company Bill was defeated in Congress. What is generally accurate about The Aviator is the sequence involving the hearings in August 1947 into Howard Hughes' alleged war profiteering in his creation of the Hercules air transport plane, better known as the Spruce Goose. Senator Ralph Owen Brewster of Maine, played by Alan Alda in the film, was basically in Juan Trippe's pocket, and Hughes pretty much did clown him at the hearings. Brewster was primaried in the next election, 1952, and lost his Senate seat. This sideshow isn't really that relevant to our story, except to explain how and why PanAm finally began experiencing competition on various routes overseas, not just the Atlantic. The late 1940s was a period of retrenchment in the airline industry. Profits were down, expenses were up. New generations of planes were coming online all the time, such as the DC-4, the Lockheed Constellation, as famously depicted in The Aviator, and eventually the DC-6, which, with some modifications, became the DC-7, basically the last big airliner developed before the jet age. The 1950s have the reputation of being one of the most iconic eras of civilian air travel. Actually, what I think most people have in mind is the very end of the 1950s, which very much was another golden age. And it was kicked off largely by PanAm. For most of the decade, though, it was kind of a grinding arms race of planes, routes, corporate mergers, both successful and unsuccessful, and political warfare, like we saw with the Community Company proposal. But jets were always on the horizon since their first experimental applications at the end of World War II. Whenever there was a technological advance in aviation, Juan Trippe was usually the first to figure out how to turn it into a profit for commercial air travel. That's exactly what he did at the end of the 1950s, with the plane perhaps most singularly associated with PanAm, the 707. That's in the next chapter. At the very end of World War II, Charles Lindbergh, who had previously worked for PanAm as a consultant, toured Germany to evaluate aviation developments of the defeated Nazi regime. During this trip, Lindbergh viewed one of Germany's groundbreaking jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262, which made no difference in the war itself, but had a profound effect on aviation after it was over. In the 1950s, Lindbergh, who was again working for PanAm after the wartime fallout of his isolationist political activities and his public feud with Franklin Roosevelt, once all that died down, he did some more recon for Juan Trippe, specifically evaluating the de Havilland Comet, the first jet airliner that had just been introduced in the UK. The Comet, Lindbergh told Trippe, didn't have the range to fly the Atlantic non-stop, but the plane was a stepping stone to the larger possibility Trippe was already envisioning, which was a fleet of transatlantic jet airliners. Trippe considered buying Comets for PanAm, and at one point had 3 on order, before he came up with a uniquely Juan Trippian idea. Why not set the 2 biggest U.S. manufacturers, Boeing and Douglas, against each other in a competition to build jet airplanes for their biggest airline customer? This was the deal of Juan Trippe's career, and it made PanAm's second golden age. How he did it is pretty ingenious. It started not with the planes themselves, but with engines, a highly experimental and almost theoretical civilian version of a military engine called the J-57 that was then being installed on B-52 bombers. Pratt & Whitney made these engines. The more powerful civilian version, which was called the J-75, was what Trippe wanted on an airliner. It would have the speed, power, and range to enable a plane to cross the Atlantic non-stop. He made a deal with Pratt & Whitney for the J-75 engines, $40 million worth of them, before the planes they would be stuck onto were even finished designing. Then, with his huge order for engines in hand, Trippe browbeat the heads of the two aircraft manufacturers, William McPherson Allen of Boeing and Donald Douglas of the Douglas Company, into redesigning the prototype airliners they were then sketching out to use the J-75 engines. Allen tried to hold out, and after fierce negotiations, told Trippe that he was going to have to take the new plane they were designing, the 707, as is, meaning without the J-75s, or leave it. Trippe said, okay, I guess I'll buy 21 of them. But at the same time, in fact on exactly the same day in October 1955, Trippe signed a contract with Douglas, who had agreed to redesign their new prototype, the DC-8, around the J-75 engines. He would take 25 of those. When Allen of Boeing found this out, at a cocktail party of all things, at Juan Trippe's Manhattan apartment, he realized that if he didn't want to lose out to his biggest competitor, Douglas, he better reconsider. He did. Boeing would, in fact, redesign the 707 to accommodate the engines that Trippe already bought. In the end, PanAm would get 17 of the new big 707s, 6 of the mini 707s, and 25 DC-8s. All spanking new, fast, high-capacity jet airliners that could haul passengers across the oceans faster and in greater style than ever before. It wasn't just a coup for Juan Trippe and PanAm. The deal was a sea change for the aircraft manufacturers, who now realized that propeller-driven airliners, which they'd sunk a lot of money into developing the later models of, were dead. PanAm had effectively initiated the jet age. On October 26, 1958, the first regularly scheduled transatlantic flight of a PanAm 707 departed from New York's Idlewild Airport, later renamed Kennedy Airport, headed for Paris. The flight carried 111 passengers and lasted 8 hours, 41 minutes. This flight changed the world in a lot of ways. Already the previous year, 1957, the number of passengers crossing the Atlantic by air overtook the number crossing by sea. But the advent of the Boeing 707 and the DC-8, and specifically PanAm's Boeing 707s and DC-8s, hastened the end for the great ocean liners, chief among them the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, which were retired from service in 1967 and 68, respectively. The triumph of jet airliners, and specifically the time in which it occurred, may also have affected how people thought about technology and its involvement in their lives. Jet travel that was affordable to middle-class people was a luxury unimaginable for both technological and economic reasons, even 10 years before. 1958 was the year NASA was formed. The space race was on. It seemed like the world was headed for a future that would be defined principally by technology, and a greater share than ever of ordinary people would reap the benefits. The aesthetic of the space age, embodied among other things by the architecture of the 1964 New York World's Fair, was, I think, heavily influenced by the development of jet airline travel in the late 50s, and PanAm owned that development, culturally at least. PanAm's second golden age was as much about aesthetics as economics. Don't get me wrong, the airline was raking in money by the plane load in the early 60s. Its stock had never been higher. But these years, particularly the 1960s, embodied what most of us think of when we think of the cultural legacy of PanAm. Pilots were dashing heroes in sharp blue uniforms, and it was their job to fly those sleek and beautiful planes that filled the skies over busy international airports. Stewardesses, they weren't yet called flight attendants, were chosen mostly for their looks and their sex appeal, though they were given rigorous training to do their jobs better and more stylishly than any other service workers in the airline industry, or maybe any industry. These women worked long hours and traveled endless thousands of miles to do their jobs. Most of them were highly enthusiastic about it and loved the company they worked for. Some of them died for it. There were 6 fatal accidents involving PanAm planes during the decade of the 1960s. And there were many more: mechanics, baggage handlers, ticket agents, maintenance people, all manner of support staff, most of whom never left the ground. They were all part of the Pan Am story. Much of what we think of as the Pan Am Golden Age has been immortalized in popular culture. Think of Leonardo DiCaprio, there he is again, in a Pan Am pilot's uniform, flanked by a phalanx of gorgeous stewardesses in the 2002 film Catch Me If You Can. There was a short-lived series on ABC in 2011 called Pan Am, featuring Christina Ricci and Margot Robbie, that dealt in a lot of the same kind of images. And it was set, naturally, in the mid-60s. Would James Bond fly any other airline other than Pan Am, even as late as 1989, as the Timothy Dalton incarnation of the character does in License to Kill? And naturally, assuming Pan Am survives into the 21st century, in the 60s it was unthinkable that it wouldn't, who would naturally be offering regular service to the moon? Pan Am, of course, which got some immensely valuable product placement in Stanley Kubrick's classic 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey. In fact, largely as a publicity stunt, Pan Am really did promise service to the moon. In 1964, the airline opened a waiting list for people who wanted to purchase tickets for that inevitable day when they would take passengers into lunar orbit. A few years later, the space waiting list was officially named the First Moon Flights Club. Pan Am insisted it was totally legit. At one point, it had over 90,000 names on it. It's hard to imagine any other airline in history getting away with that. Closer to Earth, Pan Am was expanding its terrestrial holdings. I haven't even talked about the line of hotels the airline owned, the Intercontinental chain, founded in 1946. The hotels were held by a subsidiary, 100% owned by Pan Am. Most of the hotels started in Latin America and the Caribbean, but they expanded worldwide during, you guessed it, the 60s. And of course there was the Pan Am building. At about the same time Juan Trippe made his fateful gambit for the 707s and DC-8s, he was also gambling on one of the largest office buildings in the world, which at the end of the 50s was planned to go up on the site just behind Grand Central Station on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. When Trippe got involved in the planning of this building, he made typically audacious demands. The airline wanted an equity stake in the property, 15 floors of space at a sweetheart rent, and perhaps most importantly, the airline's logo and name in letters 30 feet high on all four sides of the building. Trippe didn't quite get all of that. The letters ended up being only 15 feet high, but the Pan Am building, which opened in 1963 and replaced the airline's former headquarters in the Chrysler building, became an icon of the New York City skyline, although not a particularly popular one at first. But if you've seen any movie made in the 60s, 70s, or 80s that features the Manhattan skyline, chances are almost certain that you've seen the gigantic Pan Am building. It still exists, of course. You're looking at images of it now, but its later fate is intimately intertwined with the fortunes of the great airline and its inevitable decline. So that brings us to the question, perhaps the central question of this entire video. How did that decline begin and why? How did Pan Am go from the heights it reached in the 1960s to the depths it sank to in the 90s? How did the fall of this mighty airborne empire begin? The answer is complicated, but it has a lot to do with two planes, one that barely flew at all, the SST, and one that was never expected to fly for as long as it did, the 747. I'll explain those in the next chapter. SST is an acronym, and it stands for Supersonic Transport. From the moment Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the experimental X-1 rocket plane in 1947, aviation planners, including Juan Trippe, envisioned large planes, fighters, bombers, or airliners that could travel faster than Mach 1, the speed of sound. This was catnip to Juan Trippe, who was always sniffing around for the next big frontier in aviation. In the 1950s, various parties on both sides of the Atlantic were trying to develop the SST. The U.S. military was already working on the B-70 supersonic bomber being designed by North American Aircraft, and in 1959, the Eisenhower administration seemed to be getting behind it. But the real progress was being made in Britain and France, whose governments and private aviation interests were joining forces to develop a supersonic plane which would eventually become the Concorde. The problem was that the SST would require vast amounts of research and development costs to make it work. I mean vast, billions upon billions of dollars, far beyond what could be contributed either by government alone or by private industry alone. And at the end of this tunnel of money, if there was an end, there were uncertain returns. SSTs would have advantages in speed, obviously, but they couldn't carry huge numbers of passengers. They would be grotesquely expensive to operate, and they required special infrastructure, not just super long runways at airports, but dedicated flight lanes high above other air traffic. And there were environmental issues, such as sonic booms near airports, most of which were near heavily populated areas, and even potential chemical damage to the Earth's stratosphere. So, as cool as the SSTs were on paper, it's not clear they would be economically viable as airliners. Juan Trippe, though, didn't care that much. If a supersonic airliner could exist, PanAm had to have one, or several, or perhaps own a monopoly on them. At the very least, if the Brits and the French were going to have them, America and America's flag carrier had to have them. In 1963, not long after the PanAm building opened, Trippe himself got into a tiff with some pretty powerful people, the President and Vice President of the United States, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, as well as a man called Najib Halabi, whom Kennedy had appointed head of the Federal Aviation Administration and the point man on America's SST project. Kennedy was on the verge of making a decision on whether America should go all in on developing an SST. Halabi had told Trippe the decision was coming, and he wanted Trippe, who was known to be considering trying to buy one or more of the British-French SSTs, to hold off on that decision until Kennedy made his. Predictably, Trippe didn't hold off. He announced that he'd signed a deal with the government of France for an option on 6 Concorde planes if and when they were developed. JFK was pissed. Why? Because it made it look to the world like he was dithering on the SST, and PanAm decided to go around him by making a deal with the French. From Juan Trippe's perspective, though, it was just another attempt to play one party off another, the U.S. government versus France, to goad both of them into doing what he ultimately wanted, which was for somebody to commit to building an SST. It was the same kind of decision as the drama that got the Boeing 707 and DC-8 built. JFK did not go all in on the SST. There was too much opposition in Congress, who was framing the project as a bottomless money hole, which is probably true. In any event, after JFK's bad day in Dallas and the succession of Lyndon Johnson to the White House, Najib Halabi let it be known that he was thinking of quitting the FAA. Trippe decided to turn Halabi from an enemy into an ally, and so convinced him to join PanAm as a senior vice president, with a seat on the board of directors. Halabi came aboard PanAm at a crucial moment. Trippe, now in his mid-60s, was approaching retirement age, at least the age at which most executives retired. He knew he probably had one last chance to make a big, bold move to stretch commercial aviation into the future. He'd hoped that move would have been the SST, but by 1965, the fate of that project was very much in doubt. Though Trippe still believed it would eventually be built, PanAm needed a stopgap plane to tide it over until the SSTs were flying, a bridge between the 707s, which were still fabulously successful in the mid-60s, and the futuristic SSTs, whether they ended up being Concordes or something else. Furthermore, this stopgap plane would have to be economical enough to make overseas air travel feasible for everyday people. So we're talking about a gigantic plane with a huge hauling capacity, very fast, with powerful engines, but economical to operate, such that ticket prices were at least within the reach of many Americans wanting to take holidays or needing to take business trips overseas. In August 1965, the same month that American combat troops were flooding into Vietnam after LBJ's decisive escalation, many of them delivered on PanAm planes, Juan Trippe went on a fishing trip on Puget Sound in Washington state with Bill Allen, the head of Boeing. Trippe and Allen engaged in the same kind of hypothetical shadow boxing that they had done 10 years earlier when wrangling about the 707. The way Robert Gant, author of one of the major sources for this video, puts it is absolutely perfectly. Imagine Allen saying, "Would you buy it if I built it?" and Trippe saying, "Would you build it if I bought it?" The "it" in this hypothetical exchange is the Boeing 747, the largest passenger airliner in the world, which did not exist yet in 1965, but would revolutionize aviation if it was built, and it would only be built if PanAm decided to buy it. The letter of intent was signed on December 22nd, 1965. The 747 was a colossal undertaking. Each plane would cost from $17 to $20 million, 2.5 times the cost of a Boeing 707, and Allen wanted Trippe to buy 25 of the monsters, plus spare parts. That came to a bill of about $500 million, 2.5% of which PanAm would pay up front, plus more payments in 6-month intervals. PanAm would have to cough up $250 million before the first 747 got off the ground. To be sure, the 747 deal was make or break for Boeing too. The company would have to build a new production plant even before they started making 747s. PanAm wasn't their only customer either. If no other airline decided to buy the giant plane, Boeing couldn't recoup the outlay it needed to build it, and the company would go bankrupt. The deal, if it went bad, could destroy both Boeing and PanAm. On April 12, 1966, Juan Trippe went before the PanAm Board of Directors in a conference room on the 46th floor of the PanAm building. The board had to formally approve the 747 deal. Trippe, who was very confident, laid out his numbers. He told them air traffic was going to increase by 15% each year until at least 1976. The 747s, each one of which would replace 2.5 707s, would operate at a cost of 30% less, measured per seat per mile flown. It was a bargain, he said. If there was a fulcrum, a moment in history, when PanAm's rise suddenly tilted into the beginning of its fall, this moment, I think, was it. The fall of Pan-American Airways began that day, April 12, 1966, and it was basically Juan Trippe's fault. He couldn't have known it at the time. The numbers he presented to the board were all perfectly supportable at that moment, but they turned out to be fantasy. The board approved the deal, of course. The 747, Trippe's fateful gamble, would be built. This is the Hyatt Grand Central New York Hotel. It's across the street from Grand Central Station and the former PanAm building, and it used to be known as the Commodore Hotel. On May 7, 1968, in a room called the Windsor Ballroom, the annual stockholders' meeting of Pan American Airways was held, with Juan Trippe presiding, as he had at every stockholders' meeting for the past 41 years. This year, however, the news was a little different. PanAm's profits for 1967 had fallen 21.5% from the previous year. In the first quarter of 1968, revenues were up 15.6%, but expenses were also up 22.6%. The loss represented 4 cents a share. The previous year, it had been a profit of 15 cents. PanAm had started to lose money. Before this could sink in, Trippe announced quietly that he was retiring. Harold Gray, technically the president of PanAm, would succeed him as CEO. An hour later, in a meeting at the PanAm building, the board voted this change into effect. Najib Halabi, who had expected to take over PanAm after Trippe's retirement or death, was voted chairman and president, but Harold Gray was clearly going to be the man in charge. It was a fortuitous time to get out. PanAm's decline had begun in earnest, and it was visible to anyone who looked closely, but few did. Trippe's predictions just 2 years earlier of a 15% rise in air traffic well into the next decade had proven terribly wrong. Air traffic began shrinking in 1968. The golden age had peaked. PanAm's bean counters had assumed it would go on forever, but that's not the way the real world works. By the time of Trippe's retirement, the expensive fleet of 707s that he'd rammed through in the previous decade were typically crossing the oceans only half full, and the big plane, the 747, on which Trippe had staked the future of the company, hadn't even flown yet. It finally did, but only at horrendous cost and after epic design difficulties. On January 15, 1970, First Lady Pat Nixon christened Pan Am's first operational 747 at Dulles Airport in Washington. By this time, Pan Am, under the rule of Harold Gray, had gone even deeper into the 747 project, ordering 8 more for a total of 33, and signing off to build a new terminal and maintenance facility at New York's Kennedy Airport to handle the beasts, which together cost another $224 million. As a plane, the 747 was pretty cool. Even aside from its absolutely gargantuan size, it was sleek and streamlined, the endpoint of the aesthetics that aviation designers were headed in the 1950s and 60s. Everyone knows about the top deck of the 747, connected to the lower deck through a spiral staircase. In the early models, the top deck was often a cocktail lounge or piano bar. The idea of drinks and hijinks on the top deck of the 747 crept into popular culture imagery of the 70s, as much a hallmark of the decade as Studio 54. You've seen it in countless movies, not least of which were the airport disaster sequels, 2 of which featured 747s as the main setting. In 2015, I did an article on my old blog, which I recently reran on my new blog, The Garden of Memory, celebrating the life and times of the 747, which I called the sky's happy behemoth. The link to that article is in the description. In addition to fast, glamorous, high-capacity airliners perfectly designed for hops between continents, the 747 has taken on a lot of other roles that were not envisioned at the time of its original design, such as the carrier plane for the space shuttle, or more recently, high-capacity cargo planes, which high-speed delivery services like FedEx and Amazon could not exist without. None of that was supposed to have happened. No one envisioned in 1966, when they were on the drawing board, that these planes would still be flying nearly 60 years later, though Boeing finally stopped producing them in 2023. Still, Juan Trippe and Bill Allen intended them from the beginning as a stopgap measure, principally to keep Pan Am on the cutting edge of aviation until SSTs took over. They were never intended to be the final word in airliner evolution, only a stepping stone. So what happened to the SST anyway? Well, not that much. The U.S. Congress killed public funding of the SST project in 1971, after it was already largely dead anyway. The British and French did continue their Concorde project, and the first of those planes flew commercially in 1976. But the Concorde was never economical, for exactly the same reasons that were suggested in the 1950s and 60s. The shape they were required to be meant they would be cramped and have fairly small passenger capacity. Various major airports banned the Concorde because of the noise pollution issue. They were even banned for a time at New York's JFK Airport, though that was later lifted. Essentially relegated to a prestige project, the last Concordes ended service in 2003. Incidentally, research into the environmental effects of supersonic airliners led to the discovery of the degradation of Earth's ozone layer by CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were banned by international treaty in 1987. That effort itself had significant implications for efforts to combat human-caused global warming, which obviously have not been nearly as successful as the CFC ban. Uh-oh, all the climate change deniers who were watching just turned off this video in disgust and unsubscribed. Anyway, back to the 747. Though undoubtedly an advance in aviation design and culture, the big planes on which Juan Trippe made his latest gamble did not arrest Pan Am's decline throughout the 70s. In fact, they made it worse. Instead of 707s crossing the ocean half empty, it was now the big new 747 jumbos, whose seats Pan Am ticket agents were having a hard time finding butts to fill. To its credit, Pan Am operated the 747 quite safely, though because the planes had such giant capacity, incidents involving them were by definition horrendous mass casualty disasters. On March 27, 1977, in Tenerife, the Canary Islands, 2 747s, one operated by Pan Am, the other KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, collided on the runway in heavy fog. A total of 583 people were killed, the worst aircraft-related disaster in history, which ironically happened on the ground. The pilots of the Pan Am 747 who were killed were held not to be responsible. It was KLM's fault. The Pan Am 747 involved in this disaster, incidentally, was the selfsame one that Pat Nixon had christened in Washington, 7 years before. On October 24, 1978, a bit more than a month after the signature achievement of his presidency, the Camp David Accords, President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act into law. This piece of legislation, which had been coming for many years, was the single biggest seismic change in the history of the American commercial aviation industry since its beginning. And it proved, at least for PanAm, to be an unprecedented disaster, at least in terms of its survival as a company, far bigger than any air crash, terrorist incident, or economic downturn. It certainly didn't seem like that at first. In fact, in the abstract, it looked like deregulation would solve many of PanAm's most intractable problems. Of course, it didn't work out that way. Let's go back to 1970, the year 747 started to come online. Najib Halabi, remember him, had finally taken over as PanAm's CEO after Harold Gray resigned in late 1969 due to illness. PanAm had suffered some setbacks in this period, principally as a result of the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board, increasingly allowing other airlines to fly trans-Pacific routes over which PanAm had held almost a monopoly since the 1930s. But the CAB, which still had to approve all the airlines' requests for routes and even fares, was still refusing, as it always had, to give permission to PanAm to fly a significant number of domestic routes. Furthermore, the CAB and airline policy in general was strongly influenced by members of Congress who gave perks to airlines based in their states and districts. The whole process had become poisoned by politics. Unable to rescue PanAm economically or politically, Halabi was replaced in 1972 by William T. Sewell, a former bomber pilot in World War II and also high at SAC, Strategic Air Command. Sewell was kind of like a bull in a china shop. He yelled and screamed in meetings. He downsized the company, shedding nearly 15,000 jobs during the 70s. He closed some of PanAm's most traditional outposts and canceled long-standing routes. Beginning in 1976, PanAm did begin to recover. It probably had as much to do with an uptick in international air travel after the Yom Kippur War and the energy crisis of the early 70s than it did with anything that Sewell had done, but it was still pretty precarious. By 1978, the year of deregulation, PanAm had only 7.5% of the market share of overseas travel. It had 20% in the late 50s. When Carter put pen to paper, though, suddenly Sewell saw a way to save the airline. Post-deregulation, with the CAB abolished, airlines could fly anywhere they wanted. PanAm could finally get domestic routes. If you remember the discussion from Chapter 4 about how domestic routes fed overseas carriers, you'll see why this was a big deal. But the problem was, it would take at least 10 years and probably $1 billion to build a domestic airline network from scratch. The airline would have to buy lots of small planes and build out terminals in regional airports, the hub and spoke model to which most domestic airlines started to turn post-deregulation. In 1978, PanAm had more money than it used to have a few years earlier, but it didn't have 10 years or $1 billion. The only way to do it would be for PanAm to buy an existing domestic airline and take over its operations. Eastern, the airline started by World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker and now headed by former Apollo moon astronaut Frank Borman, was too big, and the relationship between them and PanAm was acrimonious. So Sewell set his sights on a smaller target, National Airlines, which was run out of Miami. Founded in the 1930s, National had a few overseas routes, especially to Cuba, at least before Castro took over, and the usual stable of domestic routes, San Francisco, LA, Atlanta, Houston, etc. National had some DC-10s, 747 or two, and a big terminal at Miami. It seemed an attractive target for PanAm. In 1979, William Sewell began buying stock of National. There was a bit of a dramatic showdown between Sewell's PanAm, Eastern, who wanted a piece of National, and a corporate raider named Frank Lorenzo, who eventually bought Eastern. But after some mishigas, American Airways formally acquired National Airlines on January 7, 1980, for the price of $374 million. Many in the press thought PanAm grossly overpaid, and PanAm's employees, especially its pilots, weren't happy. In addition to swallowing up most of PanAm's remaining cash, the National acquisition introduced a huge new problem into the airline, the question of seniority. This goes back to something that I said in Chapter 3. The pecking order of pilots, which was extremely important in PanAm's corporate culture, was based entirely on how long someone had been with the company. It was really hard to move up at PanAm. Some poor schlubs remained co-pilots or flight engineers for decades. And because PanAm had been shrinking for the last 10 years, they had hired no new pilots since 1968. By contrast, National had been hiring like crazy and people were moving up quickly. Now that they were the same company, how to integrate their workforces was a major issue. Imagine, for example, a hypothetical PanAm co-pilot, let's call him George, hired in, say, 1965, peak of the golden age. At the time of the National merger in 1980, you're just about to move up into the pilot's seat after 15 years. Now imagine a National Airlines co-pilot, we'll call him Sid, hired in 1977, only a few years ago. Under the system in place at National, he too is just about to move into the pilot's seat. If PanAm's and National's seniority lists are integrated purely on the basis of date of hire, George is obviously going to get the next pilot's slot. He's got over 12 years seniority over Sid. But what about Sid, who was just about to move up? If you do the integration this way, you send him to the back of the line for promotion, behind literally every PanAm pilot in the whole airline, because none at all have been hired for the past 12 years. Is that fair to Sid? On the other hand, if you integrate the workforce on the basis of relative seniority, Sid, who's been flying for only 3 years, might indeed get that next pilot slot, dooming George to remain a co-pilot despite 15 years in that position. Is that fair to George, who, being much older than Sid, probably has 2 kids in college by now and really needs a bump in pay? So, you see the problem. The seniority issue in the PanAm National merger went all the way to arbitration. The decision, which came out in March 1981, was a complicated pseudo-compromise that sought to preserve positions on the basis of expectations. But because people could expect to move up at National much faster than they had at PanAm, what this meant in effect was freezing most of the PanAm employees in the jobs they were at the time of the merger. Sid, in effect, would get the next pilot slot, not George. At about this same time, 1981, Juan Trippe, the old founder of American Airways, died. Though long retired from day-to-day operation of the airline, he was still technically a part of it, in an emeritus position, and occasionally attended ceremonial functions. That stopped in September 1980, when he suffered a catastrophic stroke. On April 3, 1981, a second stroke carried him off. He was 81 years old. PanAm renamed one of its 747s after him, the Clipper Juan T. Trippe. By the time of his death, the empire he founded was in severe decline. By the mid-80s, PanAm was losing $1 million a day. The National deal had been a disaster. Forced to do anything it could for cash, the airline sold the PanAm building in Manhattan to the MetLife Insurance Company, though the building retained its branding. Sewell also sold off the hotel chain, the Intercontinental, to a British conglomerate. In August 1981, while this deal was still in the works, William Sewell took early retirement. The board hired a new CEO, Edward Acker, who had formerly run Braniff Airlines and Air Florida. He was the first CEO of PanAm who had never been a pilot. After tinkering with routes and new business strategies, the equivalent of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, Acker started asking PanAm's employees to fund the airline's losses by negotiating huge salary cuts with the 5 major unions representing the employees: pilots, flight attendants, flight engineers, air transport workers, and Teamsters. They did in exchange for union representation on PanAm's board, but it merely sowed the seeds of more conflict. PanAm didn't make money. In 1984, the airline lost over $200 million. The company stopped contributing to employees' pension funds, and then a few months later extended unilaterally the pay freezes that the employees agreed to, and which were supposed to have been temporary. On March 1st, 1985, 4 of Pan Am's 5 labor unions went on strike, the first major strike in the company's history. When Pan Am hired scabs to keep operations running, the unions eventually caved. Decades-long friendships within the company had been destroyed, as well as the trust between management and the employees. It was another signpost, pointing toward the eventual end of the road. Now even more desperate, shortly after the strike ended on April 22, 1985, Ed Acker agreed to sell Pan Am's legacy Pacific routes and 18 planes to United Airlines for $750 million. It was one of the few big assets the airline had left, but it was also the core of their business. Those were the routes Juan Trippe had developed with the flying boats back in the 1930s. This was the route Indiana Jones flew in 1936, at least in fiction. One representative of the pilots' union said of this deal, quote, "It's cutting off our right arm. What's next?" By the late 1980s, basically all Pan Am had left were the main Atlantic routes, a few domestic routes that it got from National and repackaged as the Pan Am Shuttle, and some of those Latin American and Caribbean routes that had been established back in the 1930s when Juan Trippe had been playing Risk. The Pacific deal got some cash back into the coffers, and Pan Am was even able to recall some of its furloughed pilots, but nobody had any illusions. The only way the airline could truly be saved was for some deep-pocket corporate raider to come in and throw them a lifeline. Ed Acker finally left Pan Am in 1988 after a series of boardroom battles with Martin Shigrew, a former pilot who had ascended to the title of executive vice president, specifically about one of these deals, a proposed rescue by the owners of Braniff Airlines, which didn't end up materializing. The new CEO was Thomas Plaskett, destined to be the airline's last, except for a token chairmanship at the very end by Russell Ray. It's perhaps a controversial judgment that deregulation ended up exacerbating Pan Am's decline, when by all rights it should have prevented it. It did allow the airline to get the one thing it needed to survive, which was a system of domestic routes. But deregulation ushered in a new and much more dangerous era of economics in the airline industry. There were lots of new entrants into the field, but most of them didn't last very long, and even the majors couldn't make money consistently. Since 1978, every legacy airline has been in bankruptcy at least once, some of them multiple times. Deregulation has come with a great deal of unintended consequences. Pan Am could never compete in this environment. It was never built to. Juan Trippe realized back in the 1920s that an airline oriented primarily toward overseas travel simply couldn't make money in the free market. Perhaps others could, but Pan Am couldn't. The intricate web of subsidies and regulations and that troublesome CAB had held back Pan Am for decades, but it had also created the only environment in which Pan Am could really survive as a going concern. This wasn't yet clear at the end of the 1980s, but it would become clear later. A decade after deregulation, another disaster, this one entirely unforeseen, greatly hastened Pan Am's final decline. It arrived hidden in a tape player packed into a suitcase, loaded onto a Pan Am 727 in Frankfurt, West Germany. The story of that tragedy and its aftermath is in the next chapter. The story of Pan Am Flight 103 is so complicated and convoluted that it's difficult to tell it in any sort of straightforward manner. So many of the basic facts are disputed or have alternative explanations or speculations that it's almost impossible to craft a narrative of it that somebody somewhere isn't going to take issue with. I'm going to try to avoid all of that as much as possible. The purpose of this analysis is to focus on what this tragedy meant to Pan Am, not to offer a conclusive deconstruction of the whole event itself. In other words, don't fill up the comments section with your Pan Am 103 conspiracy theories. That's not what this is about. 4 days before Christmas, on the evening of December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, a 747, a Clipper Maid of the Seas, took off from London's Heathrow Airport, headed for JFK in New York and eventually Detroit. There were 243 passengers and 16 crew members on board. Although this leg of the flight involving the 747 departed from London, the official Flight 103 had actually originated earlier that day in Frankfurt, West Germany, with a 727 called Flight 103A. It was on that flight, the short 727 hop from Frankfurt to London, where a Samsonite suitcase belonging to someone booked on the flight was loaded into the baggage compartment. That suitcase was transferred exactly as it should have been to the 747 on which Flight 103 was scheduled to continue, but its owner didn't get on. The suitcase contained baby clothes and a small Toshiba cassette player in which plastic explosives had been packed. About an hour after the plane left Heathrow, while it was flying over Scotland at just after 7 p.m., the suitcase bomb exploded. The nose of the 747 was sheared off in the first few seconds. The disintegrating plane crashed into the small town of Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 11 people on the ground. The final death toll was 270. It's not entirely clear who the Samsonite suitcase belonged to, or who loaded it on the first leg of Flight 103 in Frankfurt. Years later, after many investigations and a trial in the year 2000, a Libyan man called Abdel Basset al-Magrahi was convicted in Scotland of planting the bomb and blowing up the plane, and other Libyans have stated that he was ordered to do so by Libyan dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi. There are questions about whether al-Magrahi was indeed responsible, and if he was, if Gaddafi ordered the attack. Gaddafi, the dictator who seemed to be quite insane, at least at the end of his life, had long been a thorn in the side of Western powers, particularly the United States, who carried out a series of bombing raids on his capitals in 1986 after a series of terrorist bombings in Western Europe were linked to him. The PanAm 103 attack might have been revenge for these air raids. 15 years later, in 2003, Gaddafi did formally accept responsibility for the bombing, but he may have done so for political reasons rather than because it was literally true. The admission was linked to the lifting of UN sanctions on Libya in the post-9/11 era. In any event, al-Magrahi, released from prison after coming down with cancer, died in 2012. In 2020, U.S. authorities indicted another Libyan national for the crime. That case hasn't yet been resolved, now more than 35 years after the event. In contrast to all the unresolved questions about who did it and why, the fact that the Lockerbie disaster had a huge effect on PanAm's fortunes is beyond dispute. The tragedy obviously hit the PanAm company very hard. 16 employees were dead, including pilot James Macquarie, who'd been flying with the airline since 1964. The horrifying news pictures from Scotland, which were broadcast endlessly in the days, weeks, and months after the disaster, focused on the nose section of the 747, lying in a field in Lockerbie with the PanAm logos and colors prominent and unmistakable. Somehow, the fact that it happened right before Christmas made it seem even more awful. The result, whether just or not, whether rational or not, was unmistakable. No one wanted to fly on PanAm in the wake of the disaster. Air travel traditionally fell off after the Christmas season, making the first few months of a new year lean ones for an airline dependent on overseas bookings. For PanAm, the Lockerbie disaster made the early months of 1989 a nightmare. It was said in one of the sources I consulted that PanAm 747s were so empty, their passenger compartments looked like abandoned warehouses. You could spray glitter into the air at PanAm ticket counters, and no one would have walked away sparkling. PanAm had to sell off some of its planes, a couple of new Airbus A320s that it hadn't even taken possession of yet, in order to fund its payroll for the first quarter of 1989. The slump lasted for a year. Tom Plaskett, the new CEO, was still looking for a white knight who could buy up the troubled airline and maybe, just maybe, turn it around if whoever saved it was willing to pump enough money into it. By summer 1989, when James Bond bought his ticket back to England on a PanAm flight in License to Kill and then missed his flight, really the only thing the airline had left were its transatlantic routes, including operations at Heathrow, some Latin American routes as well, and a couple in Germany. But in the era of deregulation, those couldn't make money on their own. Even to some degree in Pan Am's regulation era history, the flashy Atlantic routes were loss leaders. The Pacific had been the last real money-making asset, and Acker had already sold that to United. You had to have a domestic network behind it to feed the overseas routes. Acker screwed that up with the national deal, which never yielded the robust domestic system that Pan Am needed to survive. There were some routes in the U.S. Northeast to shuttle, but that didn't generate the cash that was really needed to keep the airline going. The next year, 1990, slowly, transatlantic passengers started to buy tickets again. People were booking their summer vacations to Europe and other places. The specter of the Lockerbie disaster had faded. But proving that truly bad luck runs in virtually unbreakable streaks, the Imperial Airline suffered another disaster, quite beyond its control. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I did one of my most popular videos on the conflict that ensued from that event. I didn't mention Pan Am anywhere in it, but it's inexplicably linked to the final decline of the airline. Exactly the same thing happened in late summer 1990 as had at Christmas '88. Everybody stayed away. No tickets, no sales. 747s crossed the oceans empty, or nearly empty. Pan Am was by now running on fumes. A few months earlier, it had sold some routes that it flew around Germany, called the Internal German Service, to Lufthansa for $150 million. That money, like everything else the airline had done to raise cash in the deregulation era, vanished pretty quickly. Its expenses were just too great, swallowing everything it made, everything it could raise, and then demanding more. In December 1990, about the same time Saddam Hussein was releasing Western hostages he'd held since the invasion of Kuwait, and as sides prepared for what looked like a pretty inevitable military conflict, the company that made Airbuses, a European consortium, canceled Pan Am's leases on 21 Airbus planes it had been operating. The airline was more than a year behind on payments on those leases. This was the last straw. Pan Am was out of money. It was simply going to have to go out of business. The only hope for salvation was some sort of last-minute deal. On January 8, 1991, 1 week and 1 day before the Persian Gulf War began, such a deal was made, tentatively. Here's how it was supposed to go. Pan Am would file Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The administration of Bush I, who didn't really want to see Pan Am go down, would give permission for Pan Am to transfer its operations at Heathrow Airport to United Airlines. And a bank, the Bankers Trust of New York, would advance $150 million to Pan Am, a third of which would be guaranteed by United. In other words, United would pump some cash into Pan Am's coffers to keep it going in exchange for the London operations, and Pan Am could survive another day to try to find a buyer who would save it. There was no time to lose. Pan Am told its lawyers, the Manhattan firm of Cleary Gottlieb, to prepare a bankruptcy filing. We're now moving into the final part of the saga. You could mark Juan Trippe's deal for the 747s and the slump of the 1960s and through the 70s as the beginning of the end for Pan Am. The chaos of the 80s, the strike, Lockerbie, and the Gulf War, that's the middle of the end. Now we get to the end of the end, which I want to spend some significant time on because it's an extremely complex story. Bankruptcy, at least for a corporation, and at least Chapter 11 bankruptcy, there are several different kinds, isn't like it is in the game Monopoly. You're not just out of money and lose the game. It's a legal process, a kind of legally organized feeding frenzy, where creditors are organized and told by a court how many chunks of flesh they can eat from the victim's corpse and in what order. When Pan Am entered bankruptcy in January 1991, no one was sure how or if it would ever get out of it, meaning once the feeding frenzy was over, if there would still be enough flesh left on the bones of Pan Am to enable it to stagger back to its feet and carry on somehow. Most companies, when they enter this sort of bankruptcy, have some kind of game plan. Pan Am didn't. It was literally existing day to day. During the winter of 1991, as the Persian Gulf War was fought and wound down, Pan Am searched for that elusive white knight who might rescue it. Surprisingly, they found one, Delta Airlines, which had started its life as a regional airline in the South, but had in more recent decades expanded to national and eventually international service. They were interested. Owning and operating Pan Am would raise Delta's stature considerably, but it was going to take a whole lot of money. In March 1991, Pan Am's CEO, Thomas Plaskett, had a bunch of meetings with the CEO of Delta, Ron Allen. Plaskett wanted Delta to buy everything, a quote-unquote total solution, his words, to the airline's existential troubles. Delta wouldn't do it. They were afraid of what's called successor liability, that they would be on the hook for paying some or all of the many, many debts Pan Am had racked up during its many years of unprofitability, some of which might not even have been discovered yet. If you ever want to scare the bejesus out of a lawyer or a corporate CEO, just run up to them and whisper the words, "successor liabilities," in their ear. They'll turn white and start sweating. It's an instinct. Trust me, it works every time. The deal that ultimately took shape during the summer months of 1991 looked like this. Delta would take control of some domestic routes in the Northeast, called the Shuttle, a remnant of what Pan Am had bought from National Airlines. And Delta would also get the North Atlantic routes. For these elements, Delta would cough up $80 million, which would keep Pan Am alive for a few more months. Then they would refashion Pan Am into a new, smaller airline based out of Miami, serving Latin and South America. Remember, they still had those old routes. This was called in the corporate and legal documents Pan Am 2, Roman numeral 2, or sometimes restructured Pan Am. Delta Airlines would own 45% of the stock of Pan Am 2, and the other 55% would be owned by the various interests to whom Pan Am owned money. That included the employees and their pension funds. In the deal, and before the bankruptcy court, these interests were represented by a creditors' committee, which had on it representatives of the 5 major labor unions that Pan Am traditionally dealt with. The creditors' committee was initially unhappy with the deal, and throughout the summer, they exerted pressure to get it changed to terms more favorable to them. They especially wanted to make sure that Delta hired as many Pan Am employees as possible. This wasn't just a corporate adventure happening on some whiteboard in a conference room somewhere, funded by theoretical money and Wall Street speculation. Real people's jobs and savings, their kids' college funds, were at stake here. Things that pilots, flight attendants, baggage handlers, accountants, maintenance people, and countless others had worked all of their adult lives to build up. The wrangling went on during the summer months. While this was happening, the top movie at the U.S. box office was Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Heinous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was finally apprehended in Milwaukee, and hardliners in the Soviet Union were quietly plotting a coup against their leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. On August 12, 1991, the main parties, Delta, Pan Am, and the Creditors Committee, presented the deal they had made to bankruptcy judge Cornelius Blackshear at his courtroom in New York City. I spoke to an eyewitness who was present in the courtroom that day. The place was packed to the rafters with spectators, lawyers, and reporters. Bankruptcy hearings don't usually attract crowds like that, but this one did. Blackshear approved the deal. Nearly everyone breathed a sigh of relief. 2 days later, a full-page ad appeared in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, an open letter signed by Plaskett, the Pan Am CEO. The exec promised, quote, "an airline that will generate $1 billion in annual revenues, employ 6,900 people, operate 50 aircraft, and have the financial strength to handle growth through the purchase of new aircraft." End quote. It sounded great, but in the harsh light of reality, and particularly an economy slipping into recession, the deal began to disintegrate pretty quickly. Plaskett, who wrote the letter, didn't have much more of a role to play. 6 weeks later, he was out as CEO, forced out largely by pressure from the Creditors Committee. He was replaced by a man named Russell Ray. The main problem was that by the fall of 1991, Pan Am was now a wounded animal that required millions of dollars every day just to keep it alive until the major surgery, the creation of Pan Am 2, could have a chance to heal it. Delta had signed a paper committing it to feed about $140 million into the pipeline. But Delta and PanAm disagreed on exactly what that commitment meant, when feeding time was, and how much at one time, and how fast. On October 22nd, 1991, Delta and PanAm signed an agreement clarifying what the funding commitment really meant. The animal got another plate full of cash. But the creditors' committee was unhappy again, and they had a reason to be. As part of the reorganization, the unions would collectively have to absorb a bunch of new concessions, totaling $43 million. It was the only way to keep the airline afloat, management told them, until PanAm 2 could launch. They, the creditors' committee, tried to get Delta and PanAm to change the deal by threatening to leak information to the press about how the whole thing was going sideways. A Delta executive said that doing this would depress public and travel agent confidence in PanAm 2 and would cause an effect similar to a run on a bank. In early November, somebody, in fact a member of the Teamsters Union, indeed leaked a highly downbeat letter to the press. It was printed and quoted in the Miami Herald and the Wall Street Journal. I couldn't tell from the historical evidence whether this was truly what sabotaged the deal, but it certainly had an effect. Holidays were coming up, and travel agents were not recommending that their clients fly PanAm 2 to Latin America. If PanAm went bankrupt during the holidays, they would be stranded down there. So, you want to do Christmas in Trinidad? Try American Airlines. In November 1991, PanAm's finance people were forced to report that the revenues for the month would be nearly $20 million short of what they originally forecast. Additionally, the projected bookings of PanAm 2, the new Latin American airline, were revised downward by almost $30 million. Part of the problem may have been that the other parts of the deal, closing the shuttle and transferring the North Atlantic routes, cut off the flow of travelers to the Latin American routes. Remember, overseas routes can only work as long as other routes are feeding into them. Very few people were booking what would eventually become PanAm 2. They were almost out of time. As the Thanksgiving holiday of 1991 approached, Delta's executives were now in the position of either pumping more money, tens of millions more, into PanAm to keep it alive, or whether they should cut their losses and pull the plug. The money was potentially available. Delta had $300 million ready in a bank account if they decided to go. But it would only work if that Latin American junket, PanAm 2, or restructured PanAm, could get butts in seats and get some money flowing back into the system. During the weekend following Thanksgiving 1991, the Soviet Union, a month away from its final disintegration, was itself running out of money. President George Bush I, trying to put on a happy face in light of the deepening recession that would ultimately punch his ticket out of the White House, went shopping and bought $28 worth of socks. Ralph Bellamy, an actor famous for playing Franklin Roosevelt on stage and screen, died. In New York City, it was sunny and unusually warm, 68 degrees. The Addams Family and Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear were in movie theaters. That weekend, there were various marathon meetings in corporate boardrooms and law offices all over Manhattan. One of them occurred here, at the offices of a law firm called Strook, and Levin, which only recently folded. Others happened, as you might imagine, high above Fifth Avenue in the skyscraper that Juan Trippe had custom ordered back in 1963. It was, for PanAm, the final extremity. These meetings were contentious. Russell Ray couldn't promise Delta anything. PanAm 2, if it started, would be feeble at first. The airline wasn't even listed in the yellow pages in the city of Miami. When grilled about how he planned to tackle revenue problems in the future, Ray admitted he didn't have a clue. Furthermore, the status of PanAm's negotiations with its employees' unions was uncertain. The letter that leaked to the press in November had spoiled them. PanAm was pushing for Delta to finalize the deal on some terms remotely acceptable to it, but the time clock was coming up as the month turned to December that weekend on Sunday. The fatal decision, Delta's decision to stop funding PanAm, seems to have been made late on Sunday evening, December 1st. Russell Ray recalled that Ron Allen, the Delta CEO, offered to meet with him in the PanAm building, but they chose instead to meet at one of the law firms. At the meeting, Allen said, quote, "Look, we're here on a sad note, but we're not going to continue to support your effort, and so we're not, in effect, approving your bankruptcy plan, your plan of survival, end quote. Under the bankruptcy rules, PanAm was 10 days away from presenting the court with its final plan. Only 10 more days to keep the animal alive, but Delta pulled the plug. Once it was clear that the Delta deal was dead, on Monday, December 2nd, Russell Ray, PanAm's final CEO, who'd only been on the job 8 weeks, remember, turned his attention toward trying to manage the now inevitable shutdown of PanAm in the least chaotic way possible. The most important thing was to get the planes and their crews back on American soil. The order to ground the fleet went out on the morning of December 4th. The eyewitness to these events whom I spoke to was present in the PanAm building when it became known that the deal wasn't going forward. Even he couldn't recall exactly how the news came. He said to me only, "We heard they were unwilling to proceed." It has the ring of an epitaph. The people who were there at the PanAm building waiting for word, the executives, the secretaries, the flight attendants, the pilots, the archivists, the people who swept the floor at the PanAm building, their jobs were suddenly gone, their pensions cut back, their futures uncertain. The man I interviewed said it was the saddest day of his career. He remembered what PanAm had been like in the old days. This was in a recession, one of the deepest that had occurred in the post-World War II era up until that time, and it was 3 weeks to Christmas. It's hard to imagine the emotional impact of what that must have been like. So now we return to where we started at the beginning of the video, on December 4th, 1991, with the deserted ticket counters, the planes sitting idle on the runways, the stranded passengers in the airports, and that last ever flight coming back from Barbados. More than just the company was dead. A whole era of aviation history had ended. Once upon a time, you could truthfully say that the sun never set on PanAm. It had operations all over the world, and every minute of every day, a PanAm plane somewhere was flying in daylight. Now, that was all over. All that was left were empty planes and battered baggage carts, an office building, and memories of the glory days. 1991 was a bad year for airlines in America. PanAm died at the end of the year, but the same year had also seen the end of its one-time rival Eastern and also Midway Airlines. It was 13 years since deregulation, but the first major round of corporate turmoil in the airline industry was pretty much ended with the PanAm bankruptcy. When American Airways ceased to exist, about 7,500 people lost their jobs. Many of them lived in the New York area, where the airline's headquarters had been for almost all of its existence. In the last few months, in anticipation of the Delta deal and PanAm 2 restructuring, many of those employees had moved or were planning to move to the Miami area, where PanAm 2 would be headquartered. Many people had to change their plans as a result. Some were reportedly on the road driving to Miami when the shutdown occurred. Some PanAm employees had successfully escaped to Delta before they pulled the plug. PanAm pilots of Airbus aircraft, for example, had already gone to Delta. In fact, as the deal was falling apart, some pilots tried rather desperately to re-qualify on Airbus equipment so they could be hired by Delta. Though it had effectively killed PanAm by not consummating the deal that would have saved it, Delta Airlines eventually wound up with a significant number of PanAm's old assets, including the World Port at JFK International Airport, which sported Delta's name and colors for the next 20 years. Delta continued operating flights out of the former World Port until 2013. The building was torn down amidst an outcry over historic preservation. As we saw in the first chapter, the spot where the World Port once stood is now an empty tarmac, on which Delta sometimes parks its planes. TWA also got some of PanAm's assets, such as a couple of Florida commuter routes that had been known as PanAm Express. At that time, TWA was owned by famous corporate raider Carl Icahn, who had made unsuccessful attempts to bid on various of PanAm's assets during the bankruptcy process. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, MetLife, had technically owned the PanAm building on Fifth Avenue since 1981, when the financially strapped airline sold it for cash. Even by the time of the bankruptcy, Pan Am's presence in its old headquarters was minimal. By the end, with it looking like operations would shift to Miami, they were down to 4 floors. The main legacy of the iconic airline was its name, which remained on top of the building for a year. The Pan Am building was, in fact, the last large skyscraper built in New York before new zoning laws prohibited corporate logos of that type from appearing on the exteriors of buildings. In January 1993, the big logo finally came down and was replaced with MetLife's, truly the changing of the guard. Since that time, it's been known as the MetLife Building. There are few traces left of its glory days as the headquarters of America's most iconic airline. Many caught in the aftermath of the bankruptcy decided not to take it lying down. On December 9, 1991, only a few days after operations ceased, the Pan Am Creditors Committee sued Delta Airlines, contending that Delta had breached various agreements, express and implied, by refusing to kick in that final round of funding. Many of the lawyers who had worked on the proposed deal were either involved directly or found themselves giving testimony in this case. The civil case went to trial in the Southern District of New York, the courtroom of Judge Robert Patterson, in May 1994. The final opinion in this case was issued 2 days before Christmas. The court held in favor of Delta, ruling that the airline had not been in breach of agreements to save Pan Am. Indeed, that Pan Am in its weakened condition hadn't fulfilled the conditions precedent to trigger Delta's affirmative obligations to complete the deal. The bankruptcy court decision was a major source that I used in the making of this video. The fallout from the Delta deal was not the only court case involving Pan Am that continued after the company's death. In July 1992, a Brooklyn jury found Pan Am liable for $300 million in damages as a result of negligent security procedures in the bombing of Flight 103. The Flight 103 families got in line with the rest of Pan Am's creditors. The bankruptcy court was eventually responsible for working out the payouts. The wreckage of Flight 103 was considered evidence in the long-running investigation of the bombing. Portions of the fuselage were painstakingly reconstructed by British and American investigators. Pieces of the 747 that crashed that day are reportedly still stored at this wrecking yard in Tattershall, Lincolnshire, England. In addition to various investigations, civil cases pertaining to Flight 103 are apparently still going on today in the 2020s. The later life of Howard Hughes, the famous tycoon and aviation pioneer who famously sparred with Juan Trippe back in the 1940s, is well known. His various mental conditions were portrayed in Martin Scorsese's 2004 film about him, which I referenced earlier. A recluse in his later years, Hughes locked himself in the penthouse suites of various hotels, including the famous Desert Inn in Las Vegas. Hughes refused to come out of these places, often running his favorite movies over and over again in a projection room. He was particularly obsessed with Ice Station Zebra from 1968. An unrecognizable shell of his former self, Hughes died of kidney failure aboard a Learjet in 1976. TWA, formerly Transcontinental and Western Air, later Trans World Airlines, the airlines that Hughes owned from 1939 to 1966, and which competed with Pan Am internationally, followed many eerie parallels to Pan Am's story in its later years. TWA, too, found it very difficult to compete economically in the post-deregulation environment, and it, too, suffered from bad public image due to high-profile terrorist incidents, most notably the hijacking and hostage crisis aboard Flight 847 in 1985. And TWA had its own Lockerbie-like tragedy, though not caused by terrorism, when Flight 800, an almost fully loaded 747, blew up over Long Island in July 1996. Despite many persistent conspiracy theories, Flight 800's demise was in fact caused by a short circuit in the center fuel tank. TWA was in and out of bankruptcy several times during the 1990s. A few months after 9/11, it went under for good. Its last flight was on December 1st, 2001, with its corporate remnants mostly absorbed by American Airlines. Najib Halabi, the former head of the FAA under Kennedy, who had been the CEO of Pan Am in the early 70s, went on to run a firm that supplied aviation technology to various Arab countries. In 1978, he wrote a memoir of his time in the industry. That same year, Halabi's daughter Lisa got married to King Hussein of Jordan. In fact, the two of them first met at a PanAm function. Noor al-Hussein, the former Lisa Halabi, is still alive, though her husband the king died from cancer in 1999. Najib Halabi himself died in 2003, age 87. William Sewell, who had replaced Halabi, had a quiet retirement after he left PanAm in 1981. I could find nothing on his later life. He died in Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 2005. Edward Acker, who presided over PanAm from 1982 to 88, could eventually claim 2 dead airlines on his resume. 3, actually, if you count Braniff. He had previously been the chief of Air Florida, which suffered a catastrophic crash in Washington, D.C. in January 1982, a crash that was caught on news cameras and heavily publicized, including in a TV movie. Air Florida folded in 1984 after Acker was already at PanAm. After leaving PanAm, Acker headed various venture capital groups operating in the airline industry. He was still alive as of the making of this video in mid-2024. Thomas Plaskett, the second to last CEO of PanAm, also went into the equity and venture capital finance business after leaving the airline. He also served on the board of the Greyhound Bus Company. He died in June 2021. Russell Ray, the final CEO, only on the job 8 weeks, later went on to work with British Aerospace, Inc. He is also still alive, and in December 2022 granted an interview to a podcast dedicated to the history of PanAm. The link to that podcast episode is in the description. There was an attempt to reboot the PanAm 2 idea during the 1990s. One of the assets sold in the bankruptcy was the name and instantly recognizable logo of PanAm, which was bought by Charles Cobb, a former diplomat and friend of the Bush family. Yes, those Bushes. The idea was to start an airline using the PanAm name, headquartered in Florida and serving mostly routes from there and other spots on the U.S. East Coast to the Caribbean and Latin America. It was a small operation with only 12 planes. Some former PanAm executives were involved in the attempt, but it didn't work. After only 2 years, PanAm 2 declared bankruptcy in 1998. The legacy of PanAm lives on. There are today, more than 30 years after the demise of the company, many websites, museums, foundations, and associations devoted to chronicling and preserving the history and material legacy of the airline. People still collect PanAm artifacts, from menus to clothing items to tote bags and other merchandise with the famous Blue Globe logo. There seems to be a general recognition that PanAm was much more than just an airline, a company that moved people, cargo, and mail from place to place. Whatever it was, all the things that it was, American Airways has a unique place in American and world history of the 20th century. I hope I've done its story the justice it deserves. I never flew PanAm, but part of me wishes I had. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it, recommend it to others, do all the stuff you normally do for a video you like. There is a side video connected to this one, which came out shortly before the release of this one. It's sort of a behind-the-scenes making-of type video aimed at pulling back the curtain to show how videos on my channel get made, by using this one on PanAm as a documentary example. So if you're interested, check that out. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits at the end and also in the description. No part of the research or writing of this video was done with AI. Special thanks to my fellow history YouTuber Caliban Rising, who provided some of the graphics that appeared in this video. I don't often do that much that crosses over into Caliban's wheelhouse, but I was really glad to find an opportunity to reach out to him on this one, and I highly recommend Caliban Rising if you're at all into aviation history, especially military aviation of the World War I and II eras. I teach history courses online at my website, seanmunger.com. I also had a book come out in April, a mystery novel, Daniel Vanished, which is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that is in the description. As part of the process of making this video, I ran an article on my blog, The Garden of Memory, specifically about the history of the Boeing 747, which I mentioned earlier. The link to that is in the description as well. Sign up for my blog. It's an email newsletter format for some interesting thoughts on history, culture, and the occasional current event. It's at gardenofmemory.net. Thank you to all my fans and supporters, and thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.